Charlie, thanks very much for that. And what we're going to do here is in a few minutes, Paul and I are actually going to have a conversation over here. But what we wanted to do, first of all, Charlie, thank you for the introduction. Just to put everything in perspective, Charlie Calkins actually heads up the whole policy area for the Florida Chamber of Commerce. So when our 30 lobbyists and the Florida Chamber gets ready to talk about next session's priorities, Charlie Calkins actually heads that board process up. And I'm pointing that out because on the 2030 initiative that we've been talking about today, next year marks the first year of 10 years where you should expect the Florida Chamber's legislative agenda to include specifics on third grade reading, on poverty initiatives. We've talked a lot today about zip code level. And I'm saying that as I'm introducing Paul Renner, Representative Renner, because I don't want it to be lost on anybody. We have a future Speaker of the Florida House who is fighting with us on how to make Florida more competitive, but wanted to be here today to be part of the conversation about over the next 10 years, what can be done to improve prosperity opportunities and replace poverty with prosperity. We had a former speaker, Will Weatherford, who 4 years ago helped me launch this, and to have a future speaker want to be interested in what can we do statewide, what kind of policies can we change, improve, et cetera, so that we can actually impact neighborhoods and zip codes is really a breath of fresh air, and I think it should be wind at all of our backs. And so with that said, Charlie, you already said what I was going to say. Paul was one of the few legislators that voted with the business community, with the Florida Chamber specifically, 100% of the time this past legislative session. Paul would tell you that's not hard to do because we believe in growing the private sector and it's the right thing to do, right? So that's the outlook. But nevertheless, we appreciate you in a big, big way, Paul. Paul's a good friend of the Chamber, and you're about to hear his perspective on kind of what happened and where we are. I think you'll get to know him a little bit. And then after that, I'll spend a few minutes interviewing him with a few questions, and we'll go from there. Paul, thanks for being here today.
Thank you so much, and it's great to be with you and to speak on a topic that I'm certainly passionate about, and that's the cause of opportunity, and specifically moving from poverty to prosperity and how we do that. And I think it really defines what a just society is all about, what America has always been about. We all love the story of the rags to riches story, someone that came up from the worst possible circumstances and made it to the pinnacle of success. And yet, even in this strong economy, which is where things start, we have this strong economy that's pulling people and has, over the course of our history, pulled people out of poverty into the middle class, and out of the middle class into the upper levels of wealth. We still see generational poverty persisting. And so what can we do to break through that? And I think it starts with a conversation really about education. And Mark mentioned the zip codes around the country where we see persistent poverty. And the model we've used for education over the years is one that is centralized, that says wherever you were born, wherever you grow up, whatever zip code you're in, that's the school you're going to go to. Maybe that's a good thing, but oftentimes it's not. Maybe it meets some of your needs, but oftentimes not all of your needs. And so the first thing we have to look at is revisioning what public education really means. And that means we get you a world-class, customized education, however and wherever that may take place. No longer looking just at a particular schoolhouse and a particular zip code, but getting a customized education. Even siblings learn differently. One's ahead in math, one's ahead in reading, that type of thing that really is going to create greater opportunity. The other area that is of concern is in occupational licensing. This is a bipartisan issue. I'm a conservative Republican. The Obama administration took a leadership role on this issue and described how in the 1950s we had 1 out of every 20 people had an occupation that required an occupational license. Now it's 1 in 4. And so it creates barriers, unnecessary barriers to work and opportunity that we need to get rid of. And so looking at how we can deregulate or lower the burden is important, consistent with health and safety. And so the example I would give you is someone that's saved up a little bit of money to start a barbershop. Maybe they haven't gotten an opportunity for a great education, and they don't have the skills that they need to do other things, but they're really good at cutting hair, they're social, they can make a go at that. They've saved up a little bit of money. They go to the state, and the state says, we'll take a couple $100 from you for a state license. And then in addition to that, we're going to mandate that you go to a course and go through all these hours of training. And we see in some cases we have barbers and cosmetologists in this state who have more training than an EMT. Requires more hours of training to get a license than an EMT. And so you go and pay $300 or $400 for that mandatory course, and you come back to, say, Jacksonville, where I grew up, and the city of Jacksonville says, well, welcome, before you start your barber shop and cut your first head of hair, we'll take $250 as a local business tax. And so we did a couple years ago in a bill that I ran, in addition to giving reciprocity to our military veterans coming from out of state where they have an occupational license, allowing them to operate here, and especially their spouses that are forced to come here. We also waive the fee, the state fee, for those that are at or near the poverty level. And I would encourage local governments to follow suit and make sure that we're not creating a barrier. You know, I think of opportunity as rungs on a ladder, and each rung represents a step up in prosperity. And we have, for all the right reasons, well-meaning, we have spent so much money and done so much to try to address poverty, but inadvertently remove some of the lower rungs of that ladder, so it's very difficult to get out of poverty. Occupational licensing is a government-imposed barrier to work and opportunity, and one which we should start to remove bit by bit. Along those lines, this year, and I appreciated Mr. Schofield's remarks about criminal justice reform, we did the biggest criminal justice reform in a generation this year. One of the things I'm most excited about that is making sure that, as he put it, that it is not a lifetime limit on opportunity, that we can now have more organizations coming into our prisons to train people, to get the life skills that they need to rapidly find meaningful, legitimate employment when they get out. The idea that we drop somebody off in a bus, give them $50 and say good luck, when they don't have the ability to do anything but pursue what got them in prison in the first place, is insanity. And so making sure that we're getting people trained and getting them out into the workforce. We have a situation right now, an enviable situation, where we have more work out there than people willing to fill those jobs. And I know there are many businesses that are part of the Florida Chamber who are ready to take those people. And so what we did in our bill, in part, was make sure that we've leveled the playing field so that you get an opportunity to go and not only train in prison, but also get your certification before you leave, and make sure that the prison officials are facilitating that, and also making sure that the licensing boards will not automatically disqualify you because you simply had a felony. Unless it's something of a moral nature, we're not going to put people that have committed child abuse in daycare centers, but we certainly are not going to preclude someone who made a bad decision when they were young from going into the many, many trades that are out there that pay great wages to have a life after prison. And finally, we have to obviously address other issues where it comes to cost of living, such as health care. And we'll talk a little bit more, Mark, when I sit down with you now, about how to make sure that we have an ability to continue climbing up that ladder from poverty to prosperity, and I look forward to the conversation.
All right, thank you, Paul. All right, well, welcome to the stage, and I think you and I have talked a lot about the licensing issue, and so thank you for putting that back on the table today. Just, again, a little bit of backdrop. We've been talking throughout the day about how there's no one thing we can do about ending poverty, that it's going to take a multitude of ideas. And so when you talk about that licensing, when you talk about education, right? We talked about zip codes earlier. One area that I want to go to for a moment, though, is you and I have talked in the past about sort of the backdrop of socialism, the backdrop of free enterprise, and everything that I know you believe in, Paul, is how do we create economic opportunity in every single zip code for every single person, regardless of where they were born or what their politics might be. You're getting ready to be Speaker of the House in a couple of years. But our country is very divided right now about the role of government versus the role of free enterprise. And I'm just curious if you could give us a front-end perspective on what's your outlook on how is Florida going to navigate through that?
Sure.
How does the business community help you navigate through that in a way where we don't get stuck, that we just keep on building momentum?
Sure.
That make sense?
Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
Well, I would say that, we have to look at how socialism basically freezes people out. When we talk about opportunity and upward mobility, this country has always been about that. We've been a free market, free enterprise country where we value free people and free markets to create wealth. And I think you see in socialist countries, Venezuela is the most recent example where we see a freezing out. So not only there have people failed to rise, but they've also fallen out of the middle class into poverty. And I think that's the main distinguishing difference when it comes to the opportunity agenda. It does the exact opposite of bring about equality. It actually freezes people out from getting out of poverty. And so the rich do very well, and the poor remain poor. and oftentimes the middle class find themselves slipping backwards. We've seen over the life of our country people come out of poverty into the middle class, and our standard of living, it's indisputable that our standard of living has gone up relative to our peers around the world because of our free market system.
Yeah, it's interesting when we talk about the rest of the world. We're all familiar with this notion of the one percenters that George Soros put on the table a couple of years ago. And what's interesting, we've talked before, globally, if you make more than $35,000, you're part of the 1% club globally, right? So it's really kind of laughable that that would be an issue. So I know we're in agreement there. One thing that we can see on screen right now is the Florida Chamber of Foundations, the Florida 2030 Blueprint, has put a goal that by 2030, that only 10% of our kids in Florida are going to be in poverty. And right now it's 22%. We have about 900,000 kids in poverty. And so I want to appreciate what you've done on the education front. What I want to do also, you just said something about workforce and how important it is that we consider job opportunities, right? So today, there's 281,500 jobs in Florida that can't find people. Right?
Right.
And so a question for you sort of about the legislature's perspective, maybe now versus maybe into the future, is we all see the connection between, we have 900,000 kids in poverty. They need an education, they need training, they need hope. But yet we have almost 300,000 jobs that can't find people right now. And that's just going to get worse if we don't start in the early learning years. And so can you speak a little bit about the legislature, or maybe even just your own perspective? What are we going to be doing about that in terms of changing the way we think over the next couple of years?
Sure, I think it's about aligning what's out there and also identifying your passion early on. Locally in Flagler County, they have a flagship program, so at an age-appropriate level, they're learning about home construction or aviation or agriculture, and they have, 10 different choices. And so at a young age, they can identify where their real passion is. And so by the time they're in high school, they kind of know what their path is, where they want to go. It prevents them from going down the road of going in, and there's nothing against higher education. I was a liberal arts history major. I got a great education. I'm glad I went down that path. But we've had culturally a message that if you don't do that, you're not a success in this country. You've got to get a 4-year degree, or you're just not quite really successful. And that's a lie, and that's just not true. There's so many good jobs out there, and so making sure we're properly aligning at an early age, and then making sure that we have the dual enrollment program that allows for people to spend time while in high school, while the taxpayers are covering their education to get these certifications, to line themselves up to either start work right after high school or after a 2-year AA degree, or if they go on to higher education, that's fine as well. But making sure we're better aligning, I think, our workforce so that children can identify where they want to go and go in the right path. Our efforts in CTE and career and technical training this year will help start to open up again vocational training, career training.
Right. So I want to show a slide to the audience that we showed earlier today, and you mentioned healthcare. That's a question I want to ask you right now. So an earlier presenter today, Purpose-Built Communities, David, talked about 985 neighborhoods or zip codes in the country, that if we could really transform those areas, and I had never heard this statistic before, but the healthcare is about a $4 trillion item nationally. But $1 trillion of it is spent just in those 985 zip codes where there's a concentration of poverty. And so my question, I want you to talk to us a little about your outlook on healthcare. What's on screen right now is the U.S. Chamber's projected for us federal government budget, and this just simply breaks it into 2 categories. All of the entitlement mandatory spending versus discretionary spending. Think about roads, think about defense, think about the things we need to be investing more in. 10 years from now, only 2 to 3% of the entire federal budget will be discretionary. Everything else is tied up in mandated spending and entitlements. And so I'm relating that back to I know your viewpoints on health care. Turns out there's 10 root causes of poverty, and one major cause that can really keep people from moving forward is health care. So there's the access issue, there's the cost issue, there's the quality issue. What's your outlook on how we bring all this forward?
Well, this year the House passed, along with the Senate, the most far-reaching health care reform, I think, at the state level in quite some time in any state. And that does a number of things, whether it's repeal of CON to increase access to care around the state, especially in rural areas, other underserved areas. Telehealth is a big one. So the ability to go onto your phone and reach a doctor either by phone or through video, not have to leave your home or not have to leave your place of work where your employer may say it's fine for you to sit at the doctor's office all afternoon, but it's coming out of your pocket, will really help, again, in areas where people are struggling to pay their bills, struggling to get out of public assistance and get into a life of independence. So healthcare will continue to be something we've got to go after. I think everybody's got to be ready to take some pain, because if we don't, I think we'll go in the next 5 to 10 years to a government-run system. I don't particularly think that's the best way for us to go. There's nothing I can think of that the government runs more efficiently than the private sector. The private sector has delivered in all areas and all sectors the highest quality at the lowest price in everything. And the same is true in healthcare. You look at healthcare costs, in fact, areas like dentistry and plastic surgery, areas where government is less involved and less regulating, you see in real terms less cost increase than you do where government's deeply involved. We need to continue to foster innovation. We need to continue to pursue policies that reduce cost. When you reduce cost, you increase access for people because they can afford their health care while maintaining that quality.
So I want to wrap up with one last question here. So we've talked a little bit about throughout the day today. There's 405 cities, 67 counties, 34 state agencies, and we talked about the role of leadership. So you're, in a few years, going to be one of the most powerful people in Florida, Speaker of the Florida House. And we think about all of these issues relative to prosperity, poverty, prosperity, and so forth. My question's this. We laid it out today. There's what can the business community do to lead this discussion? What can philanthropy do, right? Strategic philanthropy. And then what's the role of government? And I know you and I share the view that it's really going to take all three of us working in concert. But from a leadership standpoint, what can we all do to help the Florida legislature understand at a core level the importance of making the right decisions to help end poverty, to create more prosperity in every single zip code of Florida? I know it's going to change under your leadership in a couple of years, but what could we be doing between now and then to help put you in a position where this is an imperative of the whole legislature?
Sure. Well, I think bringing us ideas. And we talked about customization, or I did a moment ago, in education, and being able to look and see where there are persistent pockets of poverty. Even in a strong economy, how do we break through that and bring those people out of poverty? And the people in this room know best how to do that. So I would encourage you to bring your ideas. I see my colleagues, Vance Lupus, who's here. Bring those ideas to us so that we can collaborate together over the next several years and put forward changes at the government level. I will say, you mentioned philanthropy, and I would be remiss to suggest by any of my remarks that government has the solution to poverty. One of the things we haven't talked about in our conversation is the role of stable families. I keep going back to faith, family, community. If you have those pieces of the puzzle, you're probably not in poverty. And I say that as a preacher's kid, just having seen the life-changing circumstances that faith brings to people's lives to bring them out of difficult circumstances. Having a strong father and mother in a child's life to make sure that they're on the right path, and strong communities. Philanthropy, all the groups that are in this room that make a community work, that fill in the gaps that government can't possibly fill. And so I don't want to leave our conversation without talking about the things that we can't do, but that the people in this room are doing and can continue to do. So I would just ask you for your partnership to bring us ideas, things that we may not be thinking about, because we do want to see everybody have an opportunity to rise in this society.
Well, I'd ask everybody to help thank Paul. We hope that he'll be here every year, and that we'll have even more legislators. We hope this is the beginning of a movement where over the next several years we can be the example for the rest of the country. So Paul, thanks for being here.
Appreciate it, man. Thanks a lot.